Welcome to the Cohort Sisters podcast, where we give voice to the stories, struggles, and successes of Black women and non-binary folks with doctoral degrees. I'm your host, Dr. Agyemang. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, Dr. Miya Carey-Agyemang, a scholar whose passion for history has led her to uncover profound narratives that have shaped the African American experience. Dr. Carey-Agyemang holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University, New Brunswick, specializing in 20th century African American and U.S. women's and gender history. Dr. Carey-Agyemang's current book project is a captivating exploration of coming of age and Black girlhood in 20th century Washington, D.C., and sheds light on the intricate interplay of identity, growth, and societal transformation. As a co-editor of Scarlet and Black Volume 3, Making Black Lives Matter at Rutgers 1945 to 2020, and a published author in Washington history, her expertise has woven the threads of history, civil rights, and gender into a compelling tapestry of knowledge. Welcome, Dr. Carey-Agyemang, to the Cohort Sisters podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about who you are when you are not working. I know you're a Jersey girl, so give us a little bit more flavor into, just a little bit about who you are, where you grew up, where you currently are now, and what are some of the things that you like to do when you are not being an amazing scholar?
Sure. So, like you stated, I am a Jersey girl, born and raised, lived there for most of my life. Lived in different parts of the state. So yes, I've seen the entire state. I am back in New Jersey. Currently, what I like to do when I'm not working, I love baking, especially during the holidays. It's a lot of fun to bake for my family and friends. I like to watch movies, binge a good TV show. I like to go on walks, especially now the weather is in that sweet spot. So, yeah, that's basically about me.
Nice. Yeah, we were just, first of all, for the listeners, this is the second time we're recording this because the first time was a struggle in complete transparency. But we bonded a lot because we're both from New Jersey, and like from not necessarily similar places in Jersey, but have overlapped in terms of like where we've lived and where we spent some time. So already feeling community with you because of that, but then also there aren't that many historians who come onto the podcast. So I always love connecting with my history folks. How did you become interested in history? Like, what was that spark for you? Were you always a history lover? Did you come to it later in life? Tell us about like what kind of got you interested in history broadly, and then specifically in the kind of work that you study around Black girlhood in the 20th century.
Sure. So I was that kid. I always enjoyed history. I always enjoyed my social studies and history classes. I was a really big reader as a kid, so I really enjoyed reading historical fiction, but also biographies and autobiographies. I love to read those. But for me, that moment where it clicked like, oh, being a historian is a job, would be an undergrad. And I walked in my first semester of college, and I had this Black woman that was teaching African American history. And I was like, wow, like I had never seen that before. It never really clicked in my mind that, like, oh, like being a historian is an actual job. So that's what really made me see, like, okay, that's a possibility for someone that loves history, enjoys history. I planned on majoring in history. That was a career path, outside of the typical K through 12 teaching that I could think about doing. And in terms of my own work, there's this saying where it's like, well, as a historian, I will say, like, part of what we do, right, we're trying to add to debates and narratives and identify gaps in the literature. And I really enjoyed researching and reading about youth culture. And I wasn't seeing Black girls in that, or Black young people in general, but particularly Black girls. And I'm just like, that's strange. Like, Black people were part of youth culture. We were young at a certain point in our lives. So why are we not a part of this narrative? So that's how I just started kind of like asking those
Yeah.
questions. And that's how I landed on my work specifically with coming of age and girl social organizations, because that allows me to kind of enter that conversation about young people and youth culture in a way. So that's how I
Mhm.
landed on what I'm doing.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I don't know if I asked you this before, but was there anything about your own youth or your own upbringing or childhood that inspired you, aside from recognizing that there was a huge gap in discussions about
Hmm.
Black girls in discussions about Black or youth culture more broadly, but was there anything about your own childhood or your own experience that kind of made you say, I feel like we should be talking about this specific moment in Black girls' lives? Was there any personal connection for you?
Sure. I mean, part of it was that I was looking back on my own experiences and thinking, like, well, I was, going through these kind of like typical teenage, milestones and issues. So I'm just like, well, we're thinking about these things, we're experiencing these things. Maybe not the exact same way, right? Because,
Mhm,
race and class and all of that
mhm.
matters, right? So maybe not in the
Yeah.
same exact ways, but it's like we are, trying to navigate these milestones and these
Mhm.
changes that come with growing up.
Yeah.
So just from my own personal experience, I'm like, well, I know surely I'm not the only young Black woman that has experienced those things. And then also, so I look at the relationship between adolescent Black girls in Washington D.C. and these social organizations. And one of the
Mhm.
social organizations that I look at is the Girl Scouts. I was a Girl Scout. My mom was a Girl Scout. So
Mhm.
there is a bit of a personal connection there as
Mhm.
well in terms of like the specifics of my research.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you shared that because I actually was wondering that, but from the last time we spoke, I was like, wait, I forgot to ask her if she was like
Yeah.
a Girl Scout or ever participated in
Yes.
those kind of like
Yes.
organized activities that
Hmm.
I don't know actually. Now I'm curious, are you involved in any contemporary discussions of is there like a decline in Black participation in organized activities? I feel like I'm just gonna have a very anecdotal thought, but I feel like with
Sure.
social media, I be blaming social media for everything with our kids these days. But part of me feels like kids are not engaged as much as they used to be in organized activities because of the internet. So I'm curious at all if you have anything to add to that comment or completely debunk it.
Sure. So I don't have the numbers, but so I look at the time period from like the
Mm-hmm.
1930s through the 1960s. And even
Mm-hmm.
by the time we get to the 1960s, there is a bit of this declining
Mm-hmm.
interest in these organized activities.
Yeah.
So based on that, again, I don't have the specific numbers, but I would say
Mm-hmm.
that it is in decline. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't really currently know any young people that are involved in any organized activities.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just also think it has to do with the fact, like, most people are in households where either one or both parents are working. So it's just like
Mm-hmm.
these demands on families.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it
Yeah.
harder to participate or to have access to these activities,
Mhm.
particularly if they're not free.
Right.
So if you're
Yeah.
already kind of in an economic space where you can't really afford to do a ton of leisure activities,
Mhm.
specifically talking about Black people and
Mhm.
other people of color, right? It's a little bit harder
Mhm.
to have
Yeah.
access to those things.
Yes. Excellent point. Excellent point. So let's get back to your academic journey. At
Yeah.
what point, you say you're in college, you have this Black woman professor teaching you African American studies, opening up your mind to the world, the possibility of actually teaching history and Black history at a collegiate level. What was the moment for you that you decided that you wanted to pursue doctoral studies, and what were some of the steps that you took on your journey towards entering your doctoral program?
Sure. So it's hard to pinpoint a specific moment, but I did have the opportunity to do an honors thesis, which includes doing original research.
Mhm.
I was able to apply for a grant through my school to fund that research, right? So doing those things that we end up doing in graduate school and as historians, it gave me a taste of like what it would be like to be in that type of role, minus the teaching part, but at least the research part. And I found that I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed kind of going to the archive with questions. Because I do think specifically, if you are going to graduate school for history, I do think there has to be a little bit more than like a love and a passion for history. Right? You can't just be like a casual, hey, I like to read and watch historical films, right? Like there has to be this passion to like answer questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's like doing that research project, it made it like evident to me, like, oh, like I enjoy kind of going into the archive, going in with questions, asking these questions, excuse me, and having them answered or challenged. So I think that was the specific moment. And in terms of preparing for graduate school, it really was about just working closely with my advisor, and letting her mentor me, right? And to give me insight about what it is to go to graduate school, what it is to go to graduate school as a Black woman, right?
Right.
So I think those were like two important moments.
So your mentor, this was in college, correct me if I'm wrong, and you were able to have a Black woman mentor in college as you're preparing for the doctoral application?
I was, and she was the only Black faculty member in that department. And really, because my interests align with African American history, she was the African Americanist in the department. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how it happened. Not saying that I didn't have other professors there that could mentor me, but I
Yeah.
just think that was such a. I think that made a huge difference because she also challenged me in different ways. Encouraging me to write the thesis, right? It was kind of like, oh, so you're writing this thesis, right? It wasn't like too much of a conversation about it. So she pushed me. So, and I
Yeah.
think that's what you get when you get a Black woman as a mentor.
Yes, which is why it's so important for there to be more of us in these
Hmm.
spaces at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, doing the work of teaching and mentoring. 'Cause that's how it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's so right. Like we need more of us to encourage more of us to go.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's a cycle that we know we're really working hard to interrupt, and to
Hmm.
insert more of us into these spaces. It
Absolutely.
not only benefits other Black women students, it benefits everyone, right? Being able to
Hmm.
have diverse perspectives in the classroom, being able to learn from people who look like you, who don't look like you, who share your identity, and can really just teach you about different elements of the world, especially in our current socio-political context where
Yes.
everything Black history is really under attack.
Hmm.
I think it's so important for there to continue to be really strong Black women scholars, historians, and educators in our field. So thank you for doing the
Absolutely.
work and continuing to continue the legacy, that was started when that faculty member started to mentor you.
Yeah.
Um, so as you uh, entered into your doctoral program, I know this, but I'm going to tell everybody else who doesn't yet know. You remained in New Jersey. You actually did all of your academic training in the same state. And New
Yeah.
Jersey, I love Jersey. Like no one can come from New Jersey when they're around me.
Correct.
However, I too, as someone who grew up in New Jersey, was like, immediately no, I will go anywhere outside of the state in order to do my educational training.
Yeah.
And that's wasn't necessarily like I didn't like Jersey. I just like wanted to get away from home. So I
Hmm.
would love for you to speak about, some of the considerations. Like what were some of the things that you were considering and debating as you were making your final decision about what graduate program to go to? And why ultimately did you decide to go to Rutgers and remain in New Jersey close to your family?
Sure. So I too love this state, but I was, determined to get out, right? Ever since undergrad, and I just kept on getting pulled back. But thinking about Rutgers in particular, there were a couple of things that factored in my decision. One was just the options that I was presented with, right? So Rutgers was the PhD program that I got admitted to. I got admitted into another program, but that would have not been like funded, whereas this would have been funded. So that's a
Mhm.
huge factor. But also just, thinking about who is at the school, the faculty that I can work with, like in terms of doing African American history or women's and gender history, Rutgers is such a wonderful and rich place to go if you are researching or studying those things. So I feel really fortunate that I was admitted into the program and I got the opportunity to study there. Even though I was determined to leave, it really was the best fit for me. And I do think, and we can talk about this kind of like the pros and cons of staying in
Mhm.
your home state
Yeah.
when you are a graduate student. One
Mhm.
thing that I went into the program not necessarily considering was the intellectual, well, I knew about the intellectual challenges of grad school,
Mhm.
but I wasn't prepared for the emotional challenges
Yeah.
of grad
Yeah.
school and being near family and friends, like an established group of friends was extremely helpful. I could, after a day of working, I can go to my cousin's house and decompress. So
Mhm.
there are definitely pros with that. A potential con could be, you're not outwardly trying to build relationships with people in your institution, in your program, because you already have this kind of like set group of people that you have.
Mhm.
But, I made sure to build network and community outside of my family and already established group of
Mhm.
friends.
Yeah. And out of curiosity, how far away like was campus from your family? Were they like 15 minutes away, an hour away? Like how I'm just trying to understand how close were y'all?
Yeah, so in terms of my extended family, like I mentioned, my cousin, it's the
Hmm.
same town. So
Oh wow.
I was born in New Brunswick. I didn't like live there throughout my childhood, but that's where my family is. My mom was born and raised there. And I
Mm-hmm.
went to the New Brunswick campus of
Mm-hmm.
Rutgers, right? So my family was 10
Mm-hmm.
minutes, same town. Whereas my parents and my sister, they were further out, but, still
Mm-hmm.
an easy drive. And
Yeah.
another pro, is financial. So
Yeah.
I ended up living with my parents after I did my exams. And I was able to save a whole lot of money. So, and our funds are limited as graduate students. So I
Yeah.
think financially that was also a really great choice for me, and having
Mm-hmm.
parents that knew what I was doing, and understood like, okay, like we can't distract you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
that also matters too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's actually reminding me of I also moved not completely, but after I
Hmm.
finished my exams, I was wedding planning, and part of our like wedding saving strategy was that I would Airbnb my apartment. So anytime I would have someone, and
Yeah.
I lived in Harlem, but my parents were in Jersey, so anytime I'd have an Airbnb booking, I would take the train over to my parents' house and crash for a few days, and it was really great. But you're right, there was this understanding of you're here and we expect you to be at the dinner table at dinner time because that's what we do in this household. But we also understand that you're really working on something. And so,
Yeah.
not distracting us during the day. And I think that it's really helpful. And I don't know if I necessarily like appreciated how
Hmm.
kind and generous my parents were in that moment, not
Yeah.
just in terms of opening up their household, but really creating a safe space for me to do my doctoral work.
Absolutely.
Um, and to do it in an environment that was far more conducive than if I was like trying to be on campus, because that was not for
Yeah.
me, not my ideal work environment. So, yeah, shout out to all the families who do the hard work of supporting
Yes.
us through thick and thin, even when they have no idea what we're studying or researching or why. And they still make space for us and still welcome us home at any given point. So, shout out
Hmm.
to them.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned about being intentional about creating community because you already had a community. Like you didn't technically need to make
Hmm.
any new friends. You had people, you had family, you had friends. What were some of the ways in which you found and built community during your graduate program?
Sure, in many different ways. Just doing like social outings with people in my program. or, for example, studying for exams, right? Like doing that with other people. You take this part of the book list, I take this part, and
Yeah.
we, exchange notes and discuss what we've
Hmm.
read,
Yeah.
right? So just like doing the like actual work of graduate school with other people, if I know someone that will be, we had Starbucks writing, hey,
Hmm.
I'll join them, right? Because we did have people that, set up writing groups and all of that. So, just doing the actual work, but also making sure that you make time to like socialize with people
Hmm.
and not talk about the work of what we're doing, but
Yeah.
going
Hmm.
bowling or something like that, right? So
Hmm.
just trying to participate whenever there's an
Hmm.
activity, show your face. And I
Hmm.
know as someone that's introverted, there are times when I don't feel like going out and showing my face, but it's so important. Like I don't think I would have made it through my program if I didn't have that community, because as much as I love my friends and family, they truly don't understand what it is to get a PhD and the blood, sweat, and tears that requires. So
Yeah.
you need people that understand where you're coming from. So it was really important for me to make sure that I had community within my program.
Yeah. You mentioned that a lot of the one of the things that drew you to Rutgers was that it was had a very strong faculty contingent of identity, um, people with similar identities to you, other
Hmm.
Black women historians. Did you also find that amongst your cohort, the other doctoral students, was there a lot of diversity of racial, gender diversity?
So I wouldn't say in my specific cohort, but across cohorts,
Mhm.
for sure. Like there was, a handful in every cohort. And that's why I think it's also important to think about the faculty, but also about the students. Like if you can
Yeah.
reach out to current graduate students and talk to them about their experiences, I think that's really important. And one thing that one of my friends from grad school talked about was, creating your own cohort, right? So
Mm.
even if you aren't coming in with these people, right? Building connections with people across your cohorts, right? So you can create your
Mhm.
own kind of group and scholarly home. Because in your individual cohort, you might not find that diversity, but go out and
Mhm.
try to meet the older students that haven't taken their exams yet, right? So they're still there.
Yeah.
They're still very visible and around the department.
Hmm.
And that's where you can find kind of the group that you would like to have, or I think that can support you the most.
Yeah, yeah. But important caveat to not try to find a sixth year grad student
Correct. They
because
will
they're
not be
you're not
there.
gonna find them. Yeah, they won't be there. For good reason. They need to be writing.
Yeah.
So what were some of the biggest successes that you had during your doctoral journey, and what were some of the main challenges that you experienced?
Sure. Successes. I really saw what I was capable of. So I
Mm.
was always that, strong student. I always did well in school. Then I get to graduate school and I'm surrounded by people that are strong students and did well in school. And some of them, got their masters. I went straight through from my undergrad, so I didn't have a master's degree, right? So I'm thrown into this group of people that I perceive are smarter than
Mhm.
me and have
Yep.
much more to say than me. Um, but I finished. Like I was able to do the same work that they were able to do. Um, and I think that I did it pretty well, right? Like there was definitely growth for sure.
Mhm.
And I would say that was my biggest success, where it's like I felt like it forced me to really challenge myself
Mm.
in ways that I hadn't challenged myself prior, and I think that made me a stronger person.
Yeah.
And now when I'm hit with adversity, right, it's a little bit different, right? Because I
Mhm.
was able to persevere through that. Challenges. I kind of gestured towards this when talking about my successes.
Yeah.
Um, it was just, you know, convincing myself that I belonged there, Because again, it was just like, wow, I feel like I'm not as smart as these other people. I'm not as
Mhm.
prepared as these other people. So emotionally, it was really difficult. And, even once you get to the end of your program, and for me personally, like my first year on the job market, it wasn't great. So I see all of my friends getting these interviews and offers, and I'm just like, I'm not having that same success. So it did rock my confidence a bit, but I've recovered from it. But it's just like I just wasn't, again, I wasn't prepared for the emotions of it all when I went
Mm-hmm.
into the
Yeah, yeah.
graduate school program.
Right. And I think that it's such a big piece, but it's the one thing that's not taught. Like, there's no summer research program that will teach you how to
Mm-mm.
navigate the politics of your department as a grad student, the tensions of, the two people on your committee who don't like each other. You didn't know that before you put them both on your committee. Like, no, nothing teaches you, like, nothing prepares you for that, but there should be something that prepares you for that, because those are
Right.
often the things that like can
Yeah.
really interrupt your progress, and like really kind of
Mm-hmm.
shake your confidence in your work and your scholarship and who you are as a researcher. So, I'm now kind of like thinking through, okay, how can we actually make sure that we are getting to the nitty gritty of like the emotional support systems,
Mm-hmm.
aside
Mm-hmm.
from building community, aside from ensuring that there's adequate mentorship for folks. That just gave me some stuff to think about. um, since you mentioned it, I actually, and I don't think we talked about this the last time, but I would love to talk about the job market, because it is, I mean, every season is job market season, but the fall is definitely job market season. And history is a discipline that often produces more PhDs than there are jobs for.
Mm-hmm.
And so would love for you to expand a little bit on one, as you were wrapping up your dissertation, were you kind of timing the market in some kind of way? Did you finish completely and then go on the market, or were you kind of like writing while on the market? So one question about how you timed your approach. And then secondly, I'd love to know just a little bit more on what you were thinking about in terms of what kinds of jobs you were looking for and what kinds
Mm-hmm.
of jobs you ended up applying to.
Sure. So I was writing while I was on the market, um, because I thought that's just what you were supposed to do. I didn't. I guess because I hadn't met anyone that said like, okay, I'm gonna finish and then go on the market. I think it was
Mhm.
just like, all right, like we need something in place for when this
Yeah.
degree is over. Yeah, so I was trying to finish up the dissertation and I was on the job market. And I think part of the challenge of that is that when you're writing your dissertation, the finished product that you get sometimes isn't what you think you're doing, if that
Hmm.
makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's like you're telling a different narrative than what you think you're actually telling. So I think that makes it difficult to sometimes write these job
Hmm.
materials,
Yeah.
because you're still like you think you know what you're doing, but you actually, there's
Hmm.
some things that still need to be worked out. So that makes it challenging. Um, and in terms of like the decisions that factored sorry what factored into my choices for where I applied for jobs and postdocs, I had to know that I wanted to be able to live there. And I do think there is still a narrative, and I think this might be from like older faculty, where it's like you go
Hmm.
where the jobs are. And as you mentioned, right, there are more PhDs produced than there are jobs. So you're kind of
Hmm.
operating from this like scarcity
Hmm.
mindset where it's
Yeah.
like, I just want to get a job. So I should just apply everywhere. But for me, it was more like, okay, can I live there?
Yeah.
Because there was a position at an institution and I was just like, I cannot see myself living there. But I knew someone that was a former faculty member there. So I reached out to them and said, hey, how was your experience? And that conversation, I was like, I'm definitely not applying to this job. Someone else can have it. So I think like it's okay to be selective. I
Mm-hmm.
think it
Hmm.
can be kind of scary to be selective,
Yeah.
But it's just like you're gonna have to live there,
Mhm.
and your well-being is gonna be super important. It's gonna impact how you do your job.
Right.
So it's okay to be selective. That's
Yeah.
a major piece of advice that I would give.
Love that advice. I think that applies not only for people who are on the job market as they're finishing their doctoral programs, but even people who are applying to doctoral programs to start, right?
Absolutely.
So, most programs, you often have to be in residence for at least
Mhm.
through coursework. So, can you live somewhere for 3 years? Can you live somewhere
Yeah.
for 5 years? In our
Mm-hmm.
discipline, can you live somewhere for 7, 8 years?
Mm-hmm.
People take a little bit longer, often in
Yeah.
history. So, and unfortunately, the way that America is set up is that not every place is a place that a Black woman can thrive in. And
Mm-hmm.
so, being able to think through what would work best for you, but also like what support systems do you need in order to thrive in a place.
Yeah.
And it will be different for everyone. Everyone has to kind of do that self-introspective work to figure
Mm-hmm.
out whether they can and want to exist in a place for any period of time. But that should definitely 100%, as you said, be a consideration and like throw out what these other people were saying about like just go anywhere, go to
Yeah.
Wyoming or wherever, or South
Right.
Dakota. um, so I now want to talk a little bit about the book that you're working on. And before I actually talk about the book quickly, when you said about working, like applying while finishing up your dissertation and how that can be really difficult because you don't really know like what the dissertation is gonna like look like and take full shape into, that really resonated. I didn't apply there in my mind. I'm like, there's no way September of before I finish my dissertation. I can't even imagine like I think
Yeah.
I had 2 chapters done. There's no way that I could have gone on the job market. So I'm always in awe of people who can do the dissertation and the market at the same time because I'm like, that is wild, y'all. But there is a hack. I do know people, depending on how much funding you have, if you got the funding available, I know that people will defend over the summer. So, like, they'll push their
Mm.
defense date, and that essentially gives them an entire year, or at least 6 months to just focus
Yeah.
on the job. And they're maybe like making their little edits before they deposit the
Mm-hmm.
dissertation. So, that's advice for some people. If you have the luxury of time, you don't have to like rush out. But anyway, I want to talk about the book and how the book has evolved since the dissertation. As someone who's also in the book writing process and dissertation to book writing process, I'm
Yeah.
now just gonna get advice for myself here. Gonna be a little bit selfish, but what has been working for you in terms of thinking through the book, working through the book, and thinking about the book as one, a byproduct of your dissertation, but also as like an evolution of something different. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. One piece of advice that I would give is give yourself space. So, when you defend, put it away, or like after you make your edits and like submit it, put it away. So I defended in April. I don't think I looked at my dissertation again, maybe until the fall. So give yourself a few months or a couple of months to just separate yourself from it. Because I guarantee once you read it again, you will come back with new insight. And dissertation is a different genre from a book, right? So I think having that space from it really kind of helps
Mhm.
you see it with fresh eyes and figure out what the heck you're actually doing. I know specifically for me and my project, so I talk about Black girlhood. I look at these organizations, the Girl Scouts, the YWCA. I look at the debutante ball tradition, right, to help us kind of understand coming of age. And with the dissertation, I think it was more so heavily focused on the organizations and the leaders and what they're thinking about Black girls
Mhm.
with little snippets of like the Black girls themselves. And I
Yeah.
really wanted to remedy that for the book, A, because I think it makes for a more enjoyable book to read, right, when we're hearing about the young people. So one thing that I had to do was I expanded my source space. So the dissertation was heavily just, archival research. For the book, I've done oral histories that I think really helped to animate these stories that I'm trying to tell, and we get the girls, right? So it's not just what people are thinking about Black girls, how they're talking about Black girls, but what Black girls are thinking and experiencing themselves. So I think that makes for a better book.
Mhm.
What's also helpful is just having people read your stuff. Um, you know, I still participate in writing groups. I try to, present at conferences or, even workshops within my department. But even if you don't have like an institutional base, just kind of like swapping your work with other
Yeah.
people is so helpful just to get the insight of someone else.
Mhm.
That's what's been working for me. Because I realized that I needed time away from the project, but also I needed time to think. We underestimate how long it takes to think, right?
Yeah.
And just really like the book for me feels very different than the dissertation, and I needed that time to think. So I'm
Mhm.
grateful that I was able to have those postdocs because that
Mhm.
gave me some extra thinking time. Yeah.
Yes. We love a postdoc that actually lets you think and write and not
Yes.
there are some that also like have you doing a whole bunch of other stuff, but we love the ones that give you the space and time
Yeah.
that's so necessary. As a historian, what advice would you give to young scholars and students who are interested in pursuing research in African American history, gender studies, and social movements, especially in the current context where a lot of those topics seem to be under attack?
Sure. I have a couple of pieces of advice. So the first one would be to understand why you're doing it,
Mm-hmm.
because that's going to sustain you, right? If you have this purpose for why you are doing this work, then that will sustain you, and even when it's hard, right, you continue going, right, because it's this mission that you have. So I think making sure that it's clear that you have the why. um and then also, again, just like researching these places that you want to go, right? What are the faculty like? What are the
Yeah.
students like? What resources does the university have to support you, right? Not just in terms of financial support, but emotional or mental support. What do they have in place? And thinking about what you need to succeed and making sure that your institution, if it doesn't have all of those things, it has most of what you need.
Mhm.
Um, and then just also just remember why your work is important. Because as you mentioned, it's very important in the time and place that we are in right now that we continue doing this work. And if you're working with students, like they need us to do this work, right? Because I don't
Right.
think they're getting it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So those are things that I would keep in mind.
No, that's really good. Really important. And it's going to be even more important for more of us to do this work. I think I said this earlier in the episode, but with the constraints around how education, like K-12 education, can talk about certain things, I think it's going to be even more paramount for there to be at the university level lots of scholars who are committed to educating, probably re-educating
Mhm.
college students on American history, which includes women's history, it includes African American history, it includes history of social uprisings and social movements, and all the things that some folks don't want us to talk about in history.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the work that we're doing is super important.
Yeah, and they're hungry for it. You know,
Yes, yeah.
like so I'm teaching a civil rights class this semester, and
Mm-hmm.
I started off with a questionnaire, and I asked students, why are you taking this class?
Mm,
And so many of them are like, oh, well, we want to learn more than what we learned in, high school, right? Like, we don't want,
yeah.
this like whitewashed version of history. And even if you're not working with students, but you're engaged with some type of community, they are hungry
Mm-hmm.
for that. So
Yeah.
again, just like we're fulfilling a demand and a need.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that's a great reminder. So one last question before we start to wrap up. Are there rather not are there, I know there are. What are some of the untold stories? Since you mentioned earlier being really interested in history because of the gaps, and being able to talk about the gaps that exist in the literature, what are some of the untold stories and some of the gaps in perspectives that you're excited to delve into related to Black history, women's history, and especially the 20th century, like African American and women's history?
Yeah, so with my research, I talk about coming of age, and I'm really interested in decentering trauma, and how we understand Black girls coming of age.
Mhm,
If you've
mhm,
ever read something like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl
mhm,
or Coming of Age in Mississippi, which is about civil rights activist Ann Moody, um, so much of their coming of age and transition to womanhood is like through this avenue of trauma. So whether that be sexual violence or racial violence, that is what is like facilitating this transition, this abrupt transition to from
mhm, mhm,
childhood to becoming this like adult. And for
mhm,
me, again, there's this question like, surely there is more that's happening outside of trauma that is shaping
mhm.
how Black girls come of age, right? Of
Yeah.
course, not dismissing racial and sexual violence, right? Because that's there. But there's so much more that's going on. And you have communities that are keenly aware of the ways that, like, young Black people can't necessarily enjoy their childhoods in the way that other
Mhm,
groups
mhm.
have that
Yeah.
privilege to do, right? So they're creating spaces like the Girl Scouts or the Y, or even something
Mhm,
like the Debutante Ball, which I think is actually a celebration of adolescence, of the transition to womanhood. Um, they're creating these spaces to do that, so girls can be
mhm.
girls
Yeah.
and also be nurtured through this adolescent process, right? So for me, what I think I'm doing differently in this untold story that I'm trying to tell is Black female adolescence outside of trauma, right? Because you had
Mhm,
friends,
mhm.
you
Yeah.
had,
Yeah.
these women that you could, work with to kind of help you navigate these life changes. So yeah, so I that's
Mhm,
the untold story that I want to tell.
mhm. Yes. And I'm so excited that you are telling it. Cannot wait to read about the book. I'm really interested in the debutante ball piece. I feel like I've always been
Yeah.
interested in just in that culture. As an immigrant kid, that was something that I didn't really realize people did until I got to college. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, why'd y'all do that? So I'm curious as to
Yeah.
like the history of that and the celebration of that, because that was not at all my life. So
Me either.
reflecting one more time back on your doctoral journey, what is one thing that you would do differently if you had to do it all over again?
Ooh, reflecting on my doctoral journey, one thing I would do differently, take chances. Um, so I talked about how, you know, I entered graduate school. I'm surrounded by smart people. So for me, I barely talked in class. Um,
Mm-hmm,
and I wish that I would have challenged myself to, come to class with one thing to say.
hmm.
Also, talk to your professors if you are struggling. This is advice I give my students. I'm like, I need to follow this, but like,
Right.
talk to your professors. Like, hey, like, I'm not feeling comfortable with XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
How can I improve in this class? Like, I do think there's a bit of embarrassment, particularly when
Yeah,
you're a
absolutely.
graduate student and you're more of an adult.
Mm-hmm,
So it's a little bit
mm-hmm.
harder to ask for help, but ask for help from your professors. They're part of their job is to advise and
Yep.
mentor you.
Yeah.
So, ask them for support. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
something that I would have definitely done differently.
Mhm. Yeah. And I'm glad you just reminded us that that's part of their jobs, because I
Yeah.
don't think that we often think about that when we're in graduate school. I think we think that our perception is that their job is to just like hold lecture and like that's it. But no, like they're actually
Yeah.
some percentage of their requirements for tenure is service, and that includes mentoring and developing students.
Yeah.
So yes, definitely a good reminder that part of their job is to support you in and outside of the classroom. And then finally, what is one last piece of advice that you have for current or prospective Black women and non-binary doctoral students?
Sure. So for prospective students, do your research. Again, when you're researching these programs, do in-depth research before you apply. Also, make sure that you have multiple people reading your application materials. That's really helpful.
Mhm.
Just to make sure that these statements are as strong as possible.
Yeah.
That's another piece of advice that I would give. For current graduate students, I would say just remember that you belong there. You were accepted for a reason. And the reason is because they think that you are a good fit for their program and you can do
Mhm.
the work and do the
Yeah.
work successfully. So always keep that in mind because sometimes it does feel like, wow, I must have gotten in here in some type of
Mhm.
fluke.
Yeah.
And as someone that has been on the other side of admissions, you are not but here by a fluke, right?
Yeah.
People looked at your application and spoke extensively about it, right? So you
Mhm.
belong here.
Yeah, yes. Such a good reminder. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carey-Agyemang, for joining us on the
You,
Cohort Sisters podcast. We will definitely stay tuned and stay ready and waiting for the book once it comes out.
yes.
And we're excited to have you in our community.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you again for listening to this week's episode of the Cohort Sisters podcast. If you are a Black woman interested in joining the Cohort Sisters membership community, or you're looking for more information on how to support or partner with Cohort Sisters, please visit our website at www.cohortsisters.com. You can also find us on all social media platforms at Cohort Sisters. Don't forget to subscribe to the Cohort Sisters podcast and leave us a quick review wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll catch you in next week's episode.